After failing to strike new trade deals with the U.S., officials from Canada and Mexico are meeting this week in a bid to strengthen trade ties between our two countries. Our foreign affairs minister, along with our finance minister, are in Mexico for talks with that country's president, as well as Canadian and Mexican business leaders. The focus? Economic cooperation, supply chains, and trade infrastructure. Now, for more on this, Barry Appleton joins us now. He is a fellow at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo and co-director of the New York Law School Center for International Law. Barry, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure to join you.
All right, so you're a lawyer with expertise in international trade on both sides of the border. So what do you see as the primary objectives for Canada at these high-level meetings in Mexico?
Well, first of all, this meeting matters. This is a really calculated strategic moment for the Mexicans and for the Canadians. Canada and Mexico themselves have about $50 billion in two-way trade, so that's nothing to sneeze at. And that's a growing partnership, by the way. And it's not just economic, it's diplomatic. But more importantly, both countries are contending right now with these unilateral emergency tariffs under IEPA, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, imposed by the Americans. And while Mexico secured a 90-day pause and Canada didn't, the mood in Washington isn't just hostile, it's highly unpredictable. And so both sides need to sort of get together and figure out what the hell's going on.
Well, Barry, do any of these deadlines mean much legally, or are they more of a political marker, would you say?
Well, there's absolutely no law here. I'm a law professor, so I like law, but we don't have any. Frankly, the atmosphere foundationally is toxic. Dialogue is stalled. The U.S. administration has opted for power plays over partnership. Ottawa is left waiting while Washington uses these emergency tariffs to bypass the normal dispute channels. So regular deadlines don't really count. What counts is what's going on with the president. And that's really very significant for the Mexicans and for the Canadians. We're both being affected by the same disease. And that's a real problem for us, for the markets, for Canadian citizens, and for consumers.
Well, Barry, you've worked on landmark NAFTA disputes. So can you explain what an investor-state dispute settlement is? Is that relevant here at all? And given the evolving trade landscape, how do you see ISDS mechanisms changing in future deals?
Now, well, first of all, the what we call the CUSMA, what the Americans call the USMCA, and the Mexicans call the TMEC, it took out investor-state dispute settlements for Canada and the United States. There is investor-state dispute settlement for the Mexicans against the U.S., and there may very well may be a large number of disputes later on that arise. But right now, nobody is using any of the dispute processes. And the reason foundationally is that things are moving so quickly, and the United States really isn't following international law. The WTO mechanism itself is broken. Its trade courts have stopped. So the only way that you can proceed is state-to-state disputes, but they take years. And right now, we're talking about trying to deal with a situation that's in months, sometimes in days. And so there's a lot of legal complexity here. But the biggest legal complexity is whether or not the emergency tariffs are lawful, because they may very well be struck down by the courts yet again. The U.S. appeal courts had a hearing on the 31st of July, and the judges on that appeal bench were pretty tough on the government lawyers. The lower courts had turned down the emergency tariffs. They haven't been stopped because the administration said that would impact negotiations, especially with China. So the emergency tariffs have been allowed to proceed while the court case is going on. But it may very well be that the emergency tariffs, the thing that the Trade Liberation Day tariffs, that 35% against Canada, could be struck down by the U.S. courts. And if that was the case, then maybe not having a trade deal is actually better than making a trade deal right now that would be at a high rate that might be struck out. In other words, you have to decide how much risk are you prepared to take? And that's what the Mexicans and the Canadians are thinking about right now. Are you prepared to say, look, we need certainty, our markets have stopped. So are we going to be prepared to make a deal that later might be a bad deal? Or are we prepared to wait it out and see if these tariffs are going to be struck out? It's a little bit like going to the bank and when you decide for a mortgage, are you going to take a fixed rate or a variable? And nobody wants to have buyer's remorse. Nobody wants to be known as the leader that made the bad deal. But for markets, you need to have certainty, and having no deal is pretty rough. That's where we're at.
All right, Barry, let's talk about Canada-Mexico relations. How much of these meetings do you think are really about strategizing a common front ahead of future negotiations with the U.S.?
Oh, this is all about strategizing. Look, we do have a trade relationship, and that's important, but we have a common foe in President Trump. This is basically not a trade disagreement that we have. It is really trade intimidation on both sides of the border. The Mexicans have tried a very different strategy than the Canadians. And it looks like the White House has been much nicer to the Mexicans than to the Canadians. So maybe this is a way that the Canadians are going to learn a little bit from the Mexicans of what have they been doing that's been working. But at the end of the day, we're all in that same sort of volatile mix of whatever comes out from Truth Social or whatever the president says on any given day changes the weather for all of us. That's a big problem.
All right, well, Barry, supply chain resilience, as we mentioned before, it's a real key focus of these meetings. So what opportunities do you see for Canada and Mexico to really deepen their cooperation in this area? And how do you think that could impact the broader North American economy?
Canada has an opportunity to work strategically with the Mexicans. For example, we work out right now on the auto sector. We're both very integrated into the North American auto supply chain. However, what does it look like if the U.S. part of that doesn't work? I mean, could Mexico and Canada work together, try to build something that would circumvent the U.S. completely? I mean, that's not impossible now, given the strengths and the abilities between the parts that come from Canada, the assembly that's done in Mexico. There's a lot of interesting things that can come on. And in addition, if you think about what we call middle powers, those that aren't superpowers but have big economies, well, the Mexican economy is growing. The Canadian economy is already big as a G7 member. What can we do to work with Mexico to build more trustworthiness to where people are going to follow the rules? So that's another part of this whole question. And so there's a lot going on in these very short meetings with the business community and with the political leadership.
Well, there's a lot going on in the meetings, Barry, a lot going on in the world today. So with growing geopolitical uncertainty, how do you think Canada and Mexico can protect their long-term economic interests here?
Well, frankly, look, the atmosphere is toxic, dialogue stalled, and we have power plays over partnership, and that's a real problem. So it's you can't just do it alone. That's our problem. Look, we and the Mexicans have been very loyal trade partners for the United States, and all of a sudden, loyalty doesn't make a difference. Neither does what's written down in your trade deal. It didn't make a difference, and so it's very hard to try to grapple with that environment, and that's what I think we're trying to figure out together. How do we find what the administration wants? They want some tariffs. It may be that we don't go back to a tariff-free situation that we've had for many, many years. But how can we make it work for both sides? Remember, we have integrated economies on both sides. And the US is our biggest customer, and we are happen to be their biggest customers as well.
All right, well, let's see if these Canadian and Mexican officials can lay the groundwork for even stronger bilateral cooperation. Barry, thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That is Barry Appleton, international trade law expert.